I can see that we've already got quite a high number of people in the room, so I think this might be a good time to get started. Hello to everyone who's joined and welcome. Thank you for being here for this webinar, which is the first in a series organised by us at the European Network on Statelessness, or ENS. By way of very brief introduction for those of you who are not already familiar with us, ENS is an organisation that coordinates a pan-European network of members from NGOs to community-led organisations to individuals impacted by statelessness, working in partnership to build awareness around the impacts of statelessness and advocate for the rights of stateless people in Europe. I can see many people are continuing to join, but I'll get going by introducing this series of 4 webinars over the next few months, which is a part of our Stateless Journeys campaign, which aims to improve the rights of stateless refugees in Europe. Today's session specifically will focus on better identifying and responding to statelessness within refugee contexts in Europe. We've had almost 400 people register for the webinar today, which is really exciting. And I think which really indicates the growing interest in this area and reflects the importance of our campaign coalition's commitment to protecting the rights of stateless refugees in Europe. We hope that the webinar will spark some discussion on the topic, and we'd really warmly invite you to connect with us afterwards. If you'd like to, we have multiple opportunities to get involved in ENS's work, including at our upcoming annual conference in Madrid in June, which we'll share further information about at the end of the webinar, and also in the chat. So just before passing to the speakers, a brief kind of housekeeping note. As you'll see, this session is being recorded and we're hoping to make it available afterwards online for those who weren't able to participate. Your cameras will be off and microphones will be muted throughout the webinar, but would really love to hear your questions or comments. And so would invite you to pose any written questions in the chat function throughout the webinar, and we'll try to pick them up and then pose them to the speakers at the 10-minute Q&A that we have at the end. And just to note that you'll need to select everyone from the drop down in the chat to ensure that everyone, that all attendees can see your question and not just the hosts. If you have any technical questions or problems during the webinar, you'll find OPF Tech as one of the participants who'll be able to help, so please do send her a message. Without further ado, to get the webinar started, I'll give a brief introduction to our 2 fantastic speakers today. Firstly, we have Zoe Gardiner, the Policy and Research Manager at ENS. Zoe joined the ENS Secretariat in July last year to provide maternity cover for the team. And prior to this, Zoe headed the policy team at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants in the UK, and previously held policy, research and communications roles at Asylum Aid, the Race Equality Foundation, and the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. So we'll have a presentation from Zoe, followed by a presentation from Sébastien Revoy at the European Asylum Agency, or EUAA. Sébastien is a French lawyer with over 12 years of experience working in the field of asylum. He currently works as a senior asylum processes officer at the EUAA, and within his current role, he supports member states and neighbouring countries of the EU in strengthening and improving the efficiency and quality of their first instance asylum procedure. So thank you very much to you both for your participation. Thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar. And I'll pass straight on to Zoe to begin your presentation. You'll have around 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frances, and thank you for having me, everybody, and for attending today. I believe, Jan, you will now be able to share my slides. That's great. Thanks, Jan. And I'll give you a nod every time we need to move on. So yeah, good morning, or rather good afternoon to everybody. It's so great to see this strong interest from all across different countries in Europe and beyond in addressing this urgent human rights issue, improving the identification of statelessness in asylum registration and screening. Next slide, please, Jan. To be stateless is not to be recognized as a national by any country in the world. It's caused by discrimination, displacement, gaps in nationality laws, state succession, citizenship stripping, and other abnormalities in the law. Being stateless can have a devastating impact on someone's access to their rights, as well as to their sense of belonging. In Europe, our asylum systems are largely based on the assumption that everybody has a nationality. So many stateless refugees reaching Europe and applying for protection are not identified or recognized as stateless, which can cause serious problems. Our Stateless Journeys campaign at ENS calls on Europe to fulfill its duty to identify and protect stateless refugees. And today, we're going to talk about the first step that needs to take place in order for that to happen, and that's improving identification in screening and registration procedures. So today we're launching our series of policy briefings or policy primers under the Stateless Journeys campaign. And these are designed to be really short, accessible, straightforward information in plain language, targeted towards practitioners who are working directly with refugees as they arrive at the border in order to raise awareness of the needs of stateless people in refugee flows. Sorry, Yang, if you can just go back for 1 second. Sorry, just wanted to say that on this slide, you can see words from a stateless changemaker who's within our network, Lynn, and it's a fundamental part of our Stateless Journeys campaign to lift up these voices of stateless people themselves and ensure that they are heard in these conversations, including by decision makers at the highest level. And now you can go on, Jan, thank you. So the briefings that we've published provide the very top line information, what is needed to understand the needs of stateless refugees. Today, we're looking at screening and registration, and next we'll be proceeding with 3 more webinars, looking at protection for the rights of children, protecting stateless people in asylum reception and determination procedures, and protecting stateless people from detention. In addition to these themes on the Stateless Journeys website, which is statelessjourneys.org, you will also find briefings on family reunification, naturalization and integration, resettlement, and other pathways to protection. They're all available in 10 different European languages as well. So we hope that they're sort of straightforward, top line information, and there'll be a resource that can be shared widely among your networks. We hope that many of you present here today may benefit from attending a number of these webinars or from sharing it with members in your network to whom it will be relevant. And that you also might attend our major regional conference on finding solutions to statelessness in Europe, which is taking place in beautiful sunny Madrid on the 8th and 9th of June. So do look out for the registration for that conference, which we will be sending out in a couple of weeks' time. Next slide, please, Jan. So the failure to identify statelessness can cause many problems. During asylum registration and screening procedures, stateless refugees may be wrongfully assigned a presumed nationality by officials based on their country of origin or the language they speak. Women and children may be assumed to have the same nationality as their husband or father, which can mean that statelessness among children and spouses is left hidden and unaddressed for long periods. And on International Women's Day, I think we can all recognize the importance of that issue in particular. In other cases, stateless people are imputed to have the nationality of their country of origin. So for example, a stateless Kurd from Syria could be registered as Syrian, or a Bedouin could be registered as Kuwaiti or Iraqi, when in fact they don't have access to the rights and protections of those nationalities. This can cause serious problems. For example, if the situation in their home country improves, refugees may be expected and required to return home. If they are stateless but have been wrongly attributed a nationality, they may not be able to return and may end up without any protective status or any residence permit, and they may be detained in the host country. If statelessness is missed or nationality is misrecorded at this early stage, it can be very difficult to correct later. This can have a significant impact on the assessment of their asylum claim and create the risk of unlawful detention. And those are things that we'll go into in more detail in the following webinars in this series. Next slide, please, Jan. Here we have the words of a stateless Palestinian refugee from Syria, Mazen. The Greek police didn't know that there were Palestinian refugees in Syria. They did not permit me to cross the border into Macedonia like other Syrians traveling to Northern Europe. They were holding me at the border and not letting me cross, saying Syrians only. And Mazen was obviously detained at the border, as he says, and forced to undertake a much more difficult and dangerous journey in order to find the protection that he needed, because he was not identified as a stateless person from Syria when he was escaping the war there. There may be good reasons why stateless people do not identify their own statelessness. Some stateless refugees may not be aware that they're stateless. And this is the case, in fact, with Mazen, who was born in Syria and always assumed that he was as Syrian as the people he grew up with. They may also not know the relevance of their lack of nationality to their international protection claim. Or they may fear telling the authorities that they are stateless because of past experiences of discrimination or persecution. Authorities need to be understanding about this and offer multiple non-intimidating opportunities for asylum seekers to discuss potential statelessness with a view to offering the appropriate protection if needed. Sometimes people are recorded as having an unknown nationality or recorded as stateless, but then after that nothing is done about it, to refer them to a procedure to have that status properly determined, and that can again cause significant problems for them down the line. Next slide, please, Jan. So what needs to be done? The EU and national authorities and other service and support providers should harmonize procedures to identify and record statelessness. Data categories should be clearly defined and standardized. The category of unknown nationality should only be used temporarily for the shortest possible amount of time and should trigger referral to a statelessness determination procedure. Clear procedures should be put in place for reviewing and correcting errors in recorded nationality data, and this shouldn't have any impact on any potential asylum claims or the perceived credibility of any applicants. States should establish statelessness determination procedures in line with good practice and international norms. Interpreters, cultural mediators, lawyers, civil society organizations, and community groups should have unhindered access to people at registration and border crossing points. And this is really vital for a lot of support needs, but also in terms of identifying populations at risk of statelessness or who are stateless. Regulatory bodies, bar associations, and civil society should also ensure that their staff and volunteers have access to information, training, and resources to support their work with people affected by statelessness. And that includes, of course, this webinar and the series of policy briefings. Frontline officials, very importantly, must receive training and tools to give them an understanding of statelessness and nationality issues. And that's something that I'm sure will also come up in Sebastian's presentation, because I know that the EU Asylum Agency is working on this. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Thank you. Slide, please, Jan. It is absolutely vital to identify statelessness as early as possible in asylum and migration procedures. Refugee authorities must not assume that everyone has a nationality or that everyone who is stateless knows that they're stateless. You need to be aware that some people may think of their nationality as their ethnicity or the community group that they come from, rather than their formal citizenship. When registering an asylum seeker, you need to sensitively ask questions about citizenship in order to help identify people who are stateless. If someone is identified as being potentially stateless or at risk of statelessness in this way, or if the person claims not to have any nationality, the authorities conducting screening and registration should clearly record that fact, pending a full determination of whether the person is stateless in a separate procedure. If available, the person must be referred to a statelessness determination procedure. Authorities should also take into account that stateless people might face additional hurdles to proving their identity and their protection needs, which means it's critical that there are safeguards in place to ensure that they can access international protection procedures and dedicated statelessness determination procedures. There are good examples of places where a good statelessness determination procedure does exist, and good practices do exist in some European countries, but there are still far too many gaps. We have more information about best practices and on statelessness determination and on general approaches towards statelessness across Europe in our Statelessness Index, which is a database that includes a lot of detailed information about how different countries across the continent are approaching this issue. And maybe one of my colleagues can kindly put the link to that in the chat, or else I can do so afterwards. We have many further resources available, and these are aimed at decision makers as well as frontline refugee support workers and state authorities. And the briefings that we're publishing today are really the first place to look. They include links to so much more information for those of you who are keen to learn more about this issue. Ultimately, the protection of stateless refugees is a duty that Europe is too often still failing to provide. And the first step is understanding this issue, and we really hope these briefings can play a part in that. I'll leave you here with words from another one of our stateless changemaker activists on our network, Pavel. It could have happened to anyone. It could have happened to you. It is also your problem. And it's all of our responsibility to recognize that statelessness is an issue impacting people within refugee flows and offer them the protection they need. So thank you very much. And I'll be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that fantastic presentation. As Zoe said, please keep any questions flowing in the chat or comments, and we'll try and come to them at the end. But now I'll pass over to Sébastien, who, for those of you who missed the introduction at the beginning, is a member of is working as the Senior Asylum Processes Officer at the European Union Agency for Asylum, so the EUAA. Sébastien, I'll let you take over with your presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come to some questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Francis. Thank you, Zoe, for the very interesting presentation. Good morning to all. Good afternoon to all. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And indeed, as Zoe just said before, it is very nice to see the high interest on this topic of statelessness. I will not reintroduce myself, as Francis just did that. Just before I dive on the topic of today's webinar, I would just like to say some few words on the EUAA, the agency for which I work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, all of you may not be familiar with this agency. This is why I would just say some few words. I'm not going to bore you with this. The EUAA, as its name suggests, it is an EU agency, and it is in charge of the EU cooperation in the field of international protection, in the field of asylum, to make it short. And so it supports member states in cooperating among each other in the field of asylum. More precisely, it supports member states in achieving a common European asylum system called the SEAS. The SEAS, for those of you who do not know, it is a legal framework that was adopted by the EU, and the aim of it is to harmonize the interpretation and the application of the rules of asylum throughout the EU. The aim of the SEAS, to make it more concrete, it is for any application on asylum to receive the same outcome, regardless of the country where the application was submitted. So it is for member states to apply common standards, let's say, when it comes to adjudication of asylum applications. So as I said, the SEAS, the Common European Asylum System, it is a legal framework adopted by the EU. It is composed of 4 directives and 2 regulations. The 4 directives are the Asylum Procedures Directive, the Qualification Directive, the Temporary Protection Directive, the Reception Conditions Directive, and the 2 last instruments, Eurodac Regulation and Dublin Regulation. Now, I am mentioning these instruments just for you to notice that there is no instrument dedicated specifically on statelessness within the SEAS, meaning that the reduction of statelessness as such does not fall within EUAA's mandate. However, EUAA is competent in relation to statelessness, as this question of statelessness, as Zoe already said it, may arise in the context of asylum procedures. Indeed, an applicant may be identified, or let's say maybe identified as a potential stateless person during the asylum procedure. Also, it is possible that a stateless person, someone who is already identified as such, applies for asylum. All of these things that a person could be, let's say, a stateless person, or that he is indeed a stateless person, will have a strong impact on the assessment of his asylum claim. So, as I said, the mandate of the EUAA, it is to support cooperation in the field of asylum. It does this through a wide variety of activities, through training, through direct support to a number of member states whose asylum and reception systems are under pressure. And it does this also, inter alia, through the development of a high number of practical guides. These practical guides touch on a wide variety of topics. And these practical guides, they reflect the common practices, the common standards in the EU. And so they are applied, let's say, by most of the authorities that they relate to. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there is one practical guide in particular that is of particular relevance to today's topic. It is the EUAA Practical Guide on Registration. Something I should emphasize is that all of these guides are publicly available on our website. They are all available in English, but most of them are also available in other EU languages. This guide, for example, is available in English, but also in a number of other languages. There is the link, yes, on this slide. So this practical guide on registration, its aim is to compile, let's say, all of the good practices that can be applied during the registration process for asylum applications. Indeed, the registration process, varies quite widely from a member state to another. But there are good practices that can be applied, let's say, independently of the process of a member state. And so this guide is targeted first and foremost for people who are involved in the registration of asylum applications. So first and foremost, registration officers, but also supervisors, team leaders, case officers, and in fact, anyone who closely or not is involved in the registration process. I would just go very quickly through the different chapters that you see on this slide. So indeed, this guide, it touches to all of it tries at least to touch on all of the aspects of the registration process. So first the setup, the registration environment, then the three core activities that are conducted during the registration: information provision, collection of information from the applicant, and finally, identification and referral to appropriate procedures. Then there is a section on the document that is given, that is delivered to an applicant following his or her registration, and which is very important to protect him or her against refoulement. There is a specific section on specific types of registration for subsequent applications. Then different ways for verifying during the registration process the data that is collected from the applicant. And then finally, the last chapter is on how registration data can be used for the examination step. So indeed, registration data is of course important for the assessment of the claim. This is obvious, but it is also of use for channeling purposes for countries that have a triage system. It is also very useful for organization and planning purposes, and it is also very useful for identifying resource needs. Let's say if we notice that there is a new caseload that is being registered from a certain country of origin, it allows an authority to identify that there will be a need for specialized officers to work on this new caseload. Next slide, please. And so, why is this guide relevant to today's topic? As I said, the core functions of the registration process of a registration officer is to provide information to an applicant, also to collect information from the applicant, name, surname, date of birth, place of birth, etc. And the third core function is to identify and refer applicants to appropriate procedures. When someone applies for asylum, he is registered. The aim is to refer him to the asylum procedure. However, some of these applicants may also need to be referred to other procedures and other services. This is the case for vulnerable applicants who can be identified or pre-identified during the registration procedure. They are referred to specialized services, for example, unaccompanied children. It is the case also if during the registration process, the officer identifies an applicant as a potential Dublin case. In such case, the applicant will be referred to the Dublin unit. And it is also the case, inter alia, of persons who are identified as stateless persons or as potential stateless persons. I should mention here that the role of the registration process, and hence of the registration officer, is not to assess, it is not to establish, it is to provide information, collect information, clarify the statements if they're unclear, and identify and refer. It is not to assess or establish, not to assess the credibility of statements, but only, let's say, to collect. And so this is why it is very important for someone who could be at risk of being a stateless person or someone who is a stateless person to be referred to stateless determination procedures, or let's say more generally, to the national authority that is in charge of statelessness. Indeed, this guide also focuses on the fact that the registration officer should be aware of this question of statelessness. As my colleague Zoe said before, it is very important that registration officers and anyone involved, in fact, in the registration process knows about this question of statelessness, that someone can be a stateless person, and moreover, that this person may not know, in fact, that he or she is a stateless person. So all of these different things should be clear, let's say, for the registration officer. Next slide, please. So the registration officer is in charge of people who arrive to apply for asylum, and these people are very diverse. They are very diverse, whether their country of origin, whether their gender, whether their claim, whether their family situation, etc., etc. And so among all of this, I mean, within all of this diversity, there can be people who are stateless or who are at risk of being stateless. Now, statelessness is not easy to identify or to pre-identify. Here on the slide, you can see some commonly encountered profile at the bottom of the slide that we tend to encounter within asylum procedures. People can be at risk of being stateless for a wide variety of reasons, gaps in nationality law, lack of nationality law, also discrimination, of course, in nationality law. Here again on the slide, I'm not going to read it through, but you can see that people who are stateless have very different backgrounds, especially the last one, populations with complex histories of displacement. It can be very difficult to identify their nationality as a result of generations that have been raised abroad. So it is very complex, and it is not easy for the registration officer to pre-identify potential stateless cases. Again, I insist on this, I emphasize the role of the registration officer is not to determine that a person is a stateless person. It is only to identify possible stateless cases and to refer them to the appropriate procedures or the appropriate authority. But it is something that should not go unnoticed when there are such elements that appear, that arise in registration procedures. Next slide, please. So yes, so we already spoke about it, about the importance to identify stateless persons as early as possible. It is important in order to provide specific protection to address their situation as a stateless person. It is also very important to assess their claim, as it has an impact on their claim. So yes, this guide, it provides brief guidance to registration officers on how to deal with applicants who claim that they are stateless or who are unaware or unsure of their nationality. This may arise quite frequently. Some people who, yes.
Sorry, just to jump in briefly to say, you've got about 1 minute left.
Okay, I'm almost done. Thanks a lot, Francis. Okay, so yes, indeed, this guide provides guidance in one of its subchapter on how to address the case of people who claim that they are stateless, those who claim that they are stateless and have objective information confirming that they are stateless, and then for, in my experience at least, the majority of cases who are unaware or unsure. They say, I have this nationality, but I'm not sure. I come from a border region. My parents had this nationality, but never had any documents, etc. So this, it provides guidance to the officer on how to deal with such cases. And finally, last slide. So here, these are just example questions. Again, we do not favor case of registration officers to have pre-established questions. Nevertheless, in the guide, we provide several examples of the questions that can be used in order to help the officer identify potential stateless cases or stateless cases. So that is it. This was the last slide. Sorry if I went a bit beyond the time that was allocated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for that very informative and precise presentation. That's fantastic. We're going to move straight into questions now. We'll only have around kind of 5 to 7 minutes, so apologies if we don't manage to get to your question, but thank you to those who have been asking them in the chat. I'll begin with 2 which we thought were fairly similar, we could have a combined answer to, which was the question that some civil society organizations may have various agendas that are contrary to the protection of refugees and displaced persons. Are there best practices to balance both unhindered access and accountability of organizations whilst maximizing interoperabilities and building trust with affected and host states? And likewise, the question, how do we respond to government concerns that stateless determination procedures create a so-called pull factor? Thanks very much to both the people who asked those questions. And I'll leave it over to Perhaps Zoe to start, and then Sebastian, if there's anything you wanted to add, please feel free. If you can keep your answers fairly brief, that would be great, so we can try and touch on the others as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. And yeah, I'll try to be quick, but I think these are really key questions in terms of how a good and functioning statelessness determination and protection procedures can be beneficial, obviously, to stateless refugees themselves, but also to states, and of course, a good working relationship between stateless people and civil society also is so fundamental to this. So I think that there's a real lack of trust, definitely when asylum seekers are in state procedures of asylum applications, and we need to work really hard to give them a voice as much as possible. We need to, and talking about the sort of supposed idea of a pull factor as well here, you know, we need to recognize that the reality is that there are stateless people among the flows of people entering the UK seeking refuge from persecution. So ignoring the issue and cutting them out of the conversation is simply not an option. It's in everybody's interest to protect them. It's in states' interest to have a good procedure here, because if they don't do that, then it's impossible for them to identify who is on their territory and what their needs are. And of course, it results in a risk of people getting stuck in a limbo of return procedures, potentially. That's an expense and a bureaucratic issue for states, but it's obviously a human rights issue for the people impacted. It can also force people to have to live underground, unregistered, without a formal status, which is bad for the state and also for the protection of their rights as well. So I think really the key in building trust here is bringing stateless people's voices into the conversation, hearing them both on the state level and at the civil society level, and ensuring that we have a realistic approach that recognizes statelessness is an issue that we have created by creating states and nationalities, and it isn't one that is going to go away, so it's one that we have to handle.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that very succinct answer. The next question is maybe more targeted at what Sebastian, I think you'd maybe be well placed to answer, but Zoe, feel free to chip in. The proposed EU Pact on Asylum and Migration proposes a very binary approach to migration procedures for people arriving at the EU's external borders. So asylum procedures on the one hand, with forcible returns on the others. This filter would apply during screening and registration. Could you elaborate on the potential implications you see for stateless people within this?
Thank you, Francis, and thank you to the person who asked the questions. I'm sorry because I won't be able to elaborate much. All I can say is that as you all well know, international protection is granted to someone in relation to the person's country of origin, meaning country of nationality or habitual residence if the person, is a stateless person. So in any case, establishing a person's statelessness, if it's the case, is a prerequisite before being able to assess the person's case. Then on the potential implication of the pact, this I don't know, and I cannot say much on this. I'm sorry. All I can say is indeed, as it's the case now, and as it will still be the case with the pact, is that determining that someone is indeed a stateless person is a need that needs to be done before the person's case is assessed.
Thanks. If I can just jump in really quickly here to let you know that we've written a whole briefing on the pact instruments and how to protect stateless people within the instruments of the pact, and we've proposed a lot of amendments. So maybe one of my brilliant colleagues can share a link to that in the chat. And I just wanted to link it as well with the question that I just saw about the new proposed law in the UK, which proposes detention and automatic return of asylum seekers. And just to note that there are proposals in the EU Pact that proposes sort of border procedures which include detention and potential return. these would always be unsuitable for stateless people for the very obvious reason that they don't have a state very often which would accept their return because they are not the national of any state. So they ought to be protected in all circumstances from procedures of that kind. But there's more information in the briefing, and there will be more obviously in the webinar that we hold on detention and return, which is part of this series.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I think we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll just take one final question. Well, a few came up around the status of Palestinian refugees with protection in Lebanon, who seek protection in the EU, or who are coming from other third countries such as Turkey. I think there was a few questions relating to this, and so I just wanted to bring in actually a consultant working at ENS who I know is in the webinar today, who specialises in questions relating to stateless Palestinians, including from Lebanon. Cynthia, I don't know if you are able to jump in and say a few words. I can see that you've just managed to join and will need to unmute yourself if you can. I don't know if you're able to give a kind of 2-minute answer before we close.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. But now we can't.
Cynthia,
there we go. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be speaking today, so I wasn't quite prepared for joining as a video and speaker person. So this question about stateless Palestinians is obviously a really, really important one. It affects millions of people potentially. And the questions are addressed to some extent in a report that ENS and Badil published last year, which I worked on in collaboration with colleagues at ENS and Badil, a Palestinian NGO. I'm going to have to be really quick because we're really close to time. But in short, Palestinians, generally speaking, should be considered stateless under the 1954 Convention, unless they have acquired the nationality of some other country. And there are two main reasons for this. One is that although Palestine is a state, it is not fully sovereign. It is occupied by Israel. Israel controls its borders, and the exit and entry, and it controls the issuance of documents like ID documents and travel documents. And Palestine doesn't have a nationality law. And with respect to the specific question of whether they could return to Lebanon as a safe country, first of all, I'm not sure at all that Lebanon is a safe country for Palestinians. Very questionable on that. And also very questionable about whether UNRWA can adequately assist stateless persons, stateless Palestinians in Lebanon. So I think we can't go into too much detail, but the short answer is Palestinians generally should be considered stateless, and they should be protected as both stateless persons and as refugees. And there are some exclusions that may apply to stateless Palestinians under the Refugee Convention or the Statelessness Conventions, but there are also the possibility of automatic inclusion within those conventions as well.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for that very kind of last-minute intervention, but I think really helps to respond to some of the questions that were posed in the chat. And thank you to everyone who chipped in with your own kind of resources and knowledge sharing in the chat. That's really helpful. We've already gone over time, so sorry to those that we've kept on longer. But just to say that the idea of these webinars is really to have kind of continuing discussions around the topics, and we will have 3 more upcoming webinars. The first on children's right to a nationality and birth registration. A second on statelessness status determination within refugee contexts, and then finally one on detention and return. So we hope that many of these issues will kind of be able to come up again and be discussed in further depth in these webinars. We'll be sending out further information and registration links to all participants of this webinar. So just wait for the email in your inboxes. But aside from that, a huge thank you to Sébastien and to Zoe for your really brilliant presentations today. Very informative, and I think a really great introduction to some of these topics. Please also look on our website and our social media for information, for the further resources that we've mentioned today, which have also been posted in the chat, and also for further information about our annual conference in June in Madrid, which I spoke of. We have an open call for panel proposals, which closes on Friday, in fact, and would love to hear from any of you in particular, individuals or groups impacted by statelessness who wish to propose ideas. So 3 minutes over time, apologies everyone, but I hope that's not too bad going. Thank you everyone for coming, for all of the questions and the comments in the chat, and we look forward to being in touch soon. Please feel free to get in touch via our website or via email. I believe Zoe's was on her presentation. Thanks very much, and I think we're okay to stop the recording.